Hello folk, how you doing? Scotty. So I was requested to do a video response to Xexizy in relation to do with the private security with the Anarcho Capitalism. I must say that, like I mentioned, I'm not an anarchist, but I can give arguments that defend that of the anarchist position. I recently had this ludicrous comment that someone had made: if you don't support government taxation, then somehow this means that you would not have these services. It reminds me of this meme. The son says he's a libertarian, and then, the dad just jumps out the window and runs away and screams because, oh no, my roads. It's unbelievable what these people think.
As Anarcho Capitalism believes that everything should be privatised with no state of any kind, one of the first things that comes to mind is, what about the police and emergency services? Well, ANCAP say that there should be security companies that people can pay to protect themselves. So this means that if you cannot afford to pay for private security, you're open to having any crime of any sort afflicted on you, with the persecutor getting away with it all.
There is a very strong difference between the style of economy you're living under today, where the private sector costs are through the roof. A good example of that would be American healthcare. The costs of the private sector soared out of control, and you live in a high inflationary based economy. You've been faced with all the fractional reserve banking as a result of all the continuous printing of the fiat currency, devaluation of the currency. Well, of course, there's a very strong difference between that of a free market economy where you actually have money that increases in purchasing power, such as, for example, if we were to return to gold and silver. And if you contrast that to what you're living with today, somewhat of a fiat monetary system that currently in the United States is backed by petrol, which is why they call it the petrol dollar. I'm really not surprised why there's a problem today, but in a free market you've got a low inflationary based economy, and you have that of real money like gold and silver, so you have low cost of living.
But I suppose there would be no such thing as crime, because there'd be no such thing as law either.
If there was no law, then of course crime would be through the roof. It would always exist. Crime is crime. Who on earth says that under anarcho-capitalism that there would be no laws? That is simply not true. And there is a court system, and yes, there are laws.
So what different companies would enforce would vary.
You're basing this idea that the company itself is the one in charge. In a free market system, it is voluntarist. In other words, the only way you're going to make a profit in a free market economy is if you provide a service that the consumers are in demand of. If you do not provide that service, you're going to lose money and your company would go out of business. The private security companies rely upon the consumers spending that money through their voluntary choice, right? So the real king are the consumers, not the company. The reason why a private, organisation, for example, retail companies or a factory or amusement parks, the reason why they will spend the money to voluntarily bring in private security, depending on what type of security that they hire, or maybe neighbourhoods create such a company and they would hire the security to protect their neighbourhood. The reason why they've got an incentive to do so, they want returning customers when it comes to businesses. If you have such a dangerous neighbourhood, if you have such a dangerous place where crime would go through the roof and there's chances of your business being broken into, not only are the people at risk, that's a very heavy risk taking on a business, and they would make massive losses and it can put them out of business. Businesses have an incentive to hire private security in order to keep their business safe, and also for the sake of their reputation, because consumers themselves want to feel safe in such an area.
We have tourists come here all the time. We don't want them to be scared of our wonderful city, and I think they're doing great when they do that. I've been down here since 2001 and things have changed a lot. So yes, I do like it.
That's the very reason why businesses in run-down areas where there's a lot of crime don't do so well, and why businesses pack up and leave such places that are crime-ridden. Also, even when it comes down to neighbourhoods, people who live, such as the landowners, or of course the homeowners, or people living in rented property, the reason why they've got the incentive to hire the private security, might be patrol cars or a couple of policemen or whoever it may be, a secure property and neighbourhood increases the value of their property, it increases the value of their house, it increases the value of the land itself.
To add to this though, I've seen multiple ANCAPs say that the companies won't actually act as police do today, they only exist to protect private property.
Well, based on the argument of Anarcho Capitalism, all land etc. would all be privately owned, and you are correct in saying that there wouldn't be public ownership. Now again, I'm a Minarchist. I think the only thing that I would probably support government for is perhaps government ownership of military. That's a whole other story.
So this basically means unless you own private property, you're exposed to pretty much anything people want to do to you.
It's not a case that they can just do whatever the hell they like to you. Your rights are protected, and it's a case with anarcho-capitalism, you've got the non-aggression principle, and it's not lawless. You've got a court system. Commit a crime, you're going to be punished for it.
Moving on, ANCAPs are also against democracy. This is because they fear tyranny of the majority. Now, I sympathise with ANCAPs and Libertarians here that I don't believe that actions I take that only affect myself should be influenced by anyone else. However, ANCAPs say let's full out remove democracy of any kind instead of let's prevent democracy from, making me make my own life choices that have no effect on anyone else but me.
It becomes a system that ends up leading to plutocracy, where the rich end up completely controlling your life, and that's not the case in a free market. Again, you go on about these baseless claims later on with monopolies, but the whole democratic system, the immorality of it is the fact that one group of people get to impose their will upon the other group of people and infringe upon their rights.
Without a state or any way for people to make decisions as a collective, everyone really is at the mercy of corporations.
What the hell do you think government is doing to you? Big government. Now, the reason why I support as a limited small government is for this very reason. Again, people could make their own personal argument and say, well, government will eventually do this, that, and the next thing. That's their personal opinion, right? You seem to ignore the fact that government does exactly this, only 10 times worse. It really does. If we were to look at history and see what governments have done, governments have led us to countless wars, massacred countless millions of people, it's led to economic disaster, and government itself, when it takes ownership, basically is a monopoly.
As they would be the only people with any power.
And that's the laughable part when you say, as they are the only people with power. This just simply isn't true. Well, what the hell do you think it is when you are faced with, your socialism? It doesn't lead to the state just withering away. Maybe in your theoretical fantasy world under communism, the state withers away. It just isn't the real world. It's always ended in totalitarianism. When something is nationalised, who runs it? It's the government. And you pay that tax money, like I said in the previous argument, when you pay that tax money, you pay it because you're forced to, not because you voluntarily choose to do so. So government thieves from you and government runs it. That is a government monopoly.
There wouldn't be anything wrong with a corporation hindering your own personal liberties, but I guess it's only bad when a state does it, right?
Again, I'm not an anarchist, but I do know for certain that individuals' rights and their property rights are protected, so it's not a case that corporations can just abuse that.
Even outside of your work, which by the way you'll most likely be working extremely long hours as there's not anything to stop corporations from making you at the threat of losing your job.
It's just as bad as the arguments we heard of the Industrial Revolution, where they say, oh, you'd be working endless hours for such little pay, etc, etc, etc. And it was all of these baseless claims, but as we saw from real world history, we saw the working hours reducing, we saw the real wage earning growth rate increase. In fact, in the United States, we saw the real wage earning growth rate grow on average per year by 1.6%. People were becoming wealthier. The rich grew richer and the poor grew richer faster in the Industrial Revolution. That's the truth. The poor were the ones who were gaining the most from the Industrial Revolution.
You'll basically be a bitch to any and all monopolies that will inevitably form over time.
There is only one way a monopoly can form. We've seen from the baseless claims that you anti-capitalists have made, whether you're a mixed economy supporter or a Marxist, the baseless claims that you made was that Standard Oil held a monopoly and that they used predatory pricing to get there. Throughout recorded history, never has a monopoly ever stemmed from predatory pricing. Never. Therefore, there is only one way that a monopoly can form, and that is by restricting productive output. In a strongly fierce, competitive free market economy, you cannot afford to just do that, because you're going to lose customers if you do that, because you would drive up the prices. And what are consumers going to do? Consumers are just going to go where they find alternatives, other competitors who sell the same goods at a cheaper cost, at a cheaper price. What has led to restricting productive output was the very government's regulation, the interference through socialism that resulted in that very problem.
ANCAPs do not believe that in a true market, monopolies will form. But let's look at the private security idea again, and here's an example of what's going to happen. Hey, we're a new security company that would love your business. Oh, can you guys offer more protection than my current service? Well, seeing as we're smaller, no. Okay, well, this is my personal safety here, so... Oh, I'm sorry. Private property, so I can't risk it by switching to a company that could potentially be better in the future.
And this is a very silly argument, because see, if a business is small, that will reflect their profits. In other words, if there are a lot of consumers, depending on how much people are paying into such a company, that's going to determine its size, and in relation to demand. For example, it's not as simple and it isn't as fixed. And Murray and Rothbard had made this argument, because things are a question of scale. Certain parts of the economy you might require a greater level of security. In some other parts, such as neighbourhoods, for example, you might require just a small amount of security, enough to keep the streets safe or whatever. An amusement park might require greater level of security and quantity especially, and a different type of security to that of another part of the market. And that's the reason why you rely upon profits and losses, because through the profits and losses, like I argued on the economic calculation problem, you're going to need to know where you're going to allocate resources efficiently. It really depends where the market is. So if this is going to be a small company to start off with, depending how much money and how much the consumers are willing to pay, if they believe they need more security, they will put more finances into the company. They will pay that. And through that finances the security company gets, whether it's a small business or not, they're then going to hire a greater level of security, and it helps their business grow in size. The way you've painted this small business as if it's not scalable, as if it's fixed, as if it just remains small. Well, how do you think a company grows in size? It grows in size through its demand, and it really depends on where that company is going to be. Is the small business going to be in a neighbourhood, or is it going to be in a very busy area? Like, for example, you see in New York with Times Square. Now, here is a quote by Rothbard himself. He says, "How much shall the police invest in electronic equipment, fingerprinting equipment, detectives as against uniformed police, patrol cars as against foot police, etc. These are all things that you're going to have to work out. And if you can imagine a country like Great Britain, or, the United States, or, the size of New York as a state, and, New York City, you've got tons of places all over. You're going to have to work out the type of police that you're going to need, the type of security. As we've seen from government-run police, it's very inefficient in that regard. Government has been so unprepared as it didn't know what to expect. The difference is a free market with that of private police has a greater level of efficiency because it's the consumers that demand for it. That's the very reason why, through profits and losses, you find resource allocation more efficient with that of private police. So another quote that I would like to address here is by Tate Fleegley, a postdoctoral associate at the Centre for Governance and Markets at the University of Pittsburgh. As he goes on to say, private police do not enjoy the legal privileges that government police do, but are on equal legal standing with the rest of us. They want to avoid lawsuits for injury because they, not the taxpayer, will be liable. Through government police, they're guaranteed the money there from the taxpayer. The money is forced out of the taxpayer collectively, and government is just throwing a certain amount in quantity of funding from its collective pot for the police. Whereas the difference with the free market is voluntarist. Private security are solely reliant upon the consumers in order for their company to survive. Under a free market, you have police that are much less abusive to their power and position than you see with government police. As Tate Feigley goes on to say, unlike government police, they do not enjoy the benefit of a friendly prosecutor who will do all that is politically feasible to avoid getting them indicted. Private police do not have union contracts that keep them from being interrogated after a shooting or allow them to be reinstated after being fired for misconduct, as public police do. Public-run police abuse their power because they're serving the government. They're not serving the customers. Because it's publicly run. Because it's, funded by the taxpayer.
And this just repeats itself until everyone's using the same company, creating a monopoly that can and will charge whatever they like for their service, because again, it's people's personal safety. They're going to pay it.
In the free market, hundreds of different companies and different needs and wants. So it's not all the same. The neighbourhoods will pay for their own private security. And like I said, you're not going to have the same demands. You've basically made a baseless claim, and you've made up this argument to say that it would be just one company that they would pay for, and that's it. Not when there's fierce competition. You've just made it up. You haven't got any real world examples. You just made it up and claimed that that's what happens. In fact, if anything, what's led to monopoly creation is through government's intervention.
If a monopoly can form in one industry, it can form in the others just as easily. Seeing as an extremely successful company could just go ahead and buy out every other company in a certain industry in the first place.
Let's just suppose in this argument that this company was to buy over one. Each company it buys over, it becomes at a greater cost. It comes at a greater cost for them to spend, to borrow, and then spend to buy out another company. And the more it swallows up, eventually it's going to soar with debt. More competition comes along. Before you know it, this company is laden down with so much debt it can no longer afford to buy out anymore, and it just goes out of business. You're basing this off a theoretical example. You're not giving any real world historical examples.
Another important consequence of everything being privatized is information and media sources. We already see today that when companies own media, the content of the media platform is always skewed to support the interests of the company that owns it.
Let's just take, for example, the BBC. The very fault of the mainstream media is the very fact that they are being guaranteed money in their pockets. And a good example, they're bought and paid for by a big corporate elite. That's thanks to corporatism. That's the very reason why we have argued to privatise the BBC. Why? Because then, in order for the BBC to operate, in order for it to run as a business, they would require the consumer. And the consumer is not forced to pay the service.
I'm aware that in today's society we also have a problem with media information sources, but socialists want to make this problem better by removing profit as an incentive to intentionally misinterpret data.
The thing that makes me cringe about the argument that socialists want to make things better is the very fact that what you socialists are doing on social media says otherwise.
Group of just the 150 there. You've got writers, academics, linguists. So what exactly are they signing up to on this letter? Well, it was published in Harper's, it's worth saying, and let's pull out a couple of the key quotes from it. Well, they say that the free exchange of ideas is central for a liberal society. They warn against the dangers of Donald Trump, but say that moves to go counter the right and the far right have led, in their words, to an atmosphere in which free speech and views counter to the majority of others are shut down harshly. Look at this quote here. It is now all too common to hear calls for swift and severe retribution, they say, in response to perceived transgressions of speech and thought. So they're warning, they don't use the word cancel culture, but of course that is what a lot of people are dubbing this idea of cancelling out speakers and shutting down debate on social media if it's perceived to go against the mainstream.
You socialists have been banning in this cancel culture where if you do not agree with any socialist, then of course they will ban you, they will try and silence you. That's essentially what you socialists do. And if you want an example of socialist media, look at Nazi Germany. It was a socialist regime, took control over newspaper and of course radio, and controlled the radio stations of what people would listen to, and fed out propaganda. And funny enough, it matches that of the socialist mentality today. They want to, bully you and threaten you that you'll lose your job. We advocate for competition, people to provide all various different sources of information. Let the consumer decide what they want.
What really gets me is that ANCAPs revolve their ideology around the idea of freedom. It just so happens that this version of freedoms means having a very select group of people have the freedom to do whatever the fuck they want.
This idea that a select few get to decide the rest of everybody else's life. Again, where did you pull that from? Where did you get it from? Have you got any real world examples? I mean, and even in the 19th century, 70% of the wealth was going to the workers and 30% remained to that of the capitalist class. So there was no dangerous concentration of wealth in the hands of the few that would lead to this, the 1% elite ruling over everybody else. It wasn't the case. So you're contradicted by history. The issue that I have here is the fact that you're saying that, they can just do whatever the hell they like. Good luck with that. Infringing upon another individual's property rights, because you will be punished for it.
Freedom ends when it limits other people's freedoms, but from what I can tell, ANCAPs only want freedom for anyone running a business. My point is how ANCAPs advocate so much for freedom, but then they want a society that results in the majority of people's freedom being prevented.
How can you say that the majority of the people do not have the liberty, do not have their rights over their freedom of speech, etc., individual rights and liberty to go and start up their own private business or go and make something of themselves? I mean, what you're basically stating is a baseless claim.
I was also thinking, what happens if there's ever a market crash? In the 1930s Great Depression in America, there was a largely free market that had a brilliant economy up until 1929.
A free market is based on the freedom of the market to regulate itself, and the freedom of the market to regulate the ratio of money freely in the marketplace, the interest rates freely in the marketplace, and of course to have free market money determined by the free market. 1922, the Federal Reserve began open market operations. Again, what the hell's that got to do with a capitalist system? How's it free market for a central, keyword there is central, political centralization, socialism, take control over the money, the entire nation's monetary supply, political centralization, basically strips the gold standard temporarily and forces America with a fiat monetary system that people didn't even ask for. That's anti-free market.
Then for the next 6 years, or however long it was, I do forget, there was a huge economic instability and millions of people were losing jobs. It wasn't until intervention in the economy that things gradually started to improve, and that eventually the war stimulated the economy back to full health.
Who the hell told you that? Was that your government schools that taught you that nonsense? It must have been. Why? Because the lowest unemployment rate was in 1929. It sat at 3.2%. Now, although in about 1933 the unemployment rate shot up to about 24.6%, the lowest that FDR could get unemployment was down to 14. So he managed to drop it about 10%. And then what happened in 1938? The Roosevelt recession happened in 1938, causing unemployment to spike right back up to 19.0%. All FDR did was he prolonged the Great Depression. Had the market been left be down to itself, it would have corrected itself over a couple of years.
What I'm saying here is, if something similar to the 1930 depression ever took place, and you can't really say it won't because markets are just so unpredictable, what happens? I mean, what do you do? This not only fucks over the workers, but also a lot of CEOs as well. I don't see how thinking, let's just leave this until it gets better by itself, assuming it ever will, is something people would actually want to do when it's been proven in the past that intervention actually makes things recover faster.
No, history is actually against you. In fact, throughout the 19th century, what would cause the boom and bust cycle was the trying and testing of paper currency, which is against the free market. So in other words, it's not down to the free market that caused the boom and bust cycle. And in the 20th century, it was the fixing of the interest rates. So in other words, the very cause of these problems was caused by the intervention. It wasn't caused by the free market.
Another actually really important part of Anarcho Capitalism is how it deals with immigrants and refugees. Basically, ANCAPs say that no immigrants can be allowed into a country unless they're specifically wanted by a company to work for. Not that I'm sure who would be running the border control, but anyway. Basically what this means is that an immigrant needs to be given a job already before they can come into a country, as well as this they need private property to live on, so that as there won't be any kind of system to prevent them just living on the streets in this country.
What I do know is that it's based on decentralised immigration control, and what it basically means is you can't just cross onto anyone's private property and say or do whatever the hell you like. It's a case that it would be down to the consent of the private landowner, and you cannot ignore the laws of supply and demand. That's another thing that you have to pay attention to, and that's something that you socialists seem to think that you can. I seen someone saying, some rhetoric against nationalism, and they believe in having no borders and that we're just all humans of this earth. Good luck with that one.
Say you're living in a country, you have a pretty average life and you get by with your family. One day this country is victim to internal conflict and groups start raiding communities, forcing people to join up or just flat out killing civilians.
This is basically claiming that, they can just, break into riots and then all of a sudden, it's just pure anarchy, it's just like CHAZ.
And you have two options. You can either stay in your country and most likely have you and your family be killed, or you can flee to a safer countries without these problems. But hold on, does anyone actually want you in this country? Well, consider yourself lucky, because the local king, CEO, has generously offered you to live in his private property in exchange for your labour. Of course, this won't include a wage, because there's no minimum wage anymore.
The people are in control of their own economic life. It's not a case that some corporation controls everybody else and it's centrally planned. You're just making things up. It's this argument to say, there's no minimum wage, therefore there's no wage. What? Hong Kong did not bring in the minimum wage until 2010.
Tell me, does this sound familiar to something? Kind of like a system we had before capitalism, maybe with a king of some kind, or serfs, something like that. I really can't remember, but...
First and foremost, capitalism is an individualist system, right? It's based on the free market, right? It's nothing at all. What you did, you made up things in your own head, basically saying a corporation controls everybody else. It's not based on reality. It was just something you made up in your own head, right? And you give no real world examples, and then you try to say, this is like feudalism. Nonsense. If anything, feudalism is and was a collectivist system that basically was top down, and funny enough, it was based on economic central planning, in other words, which defines socialism. It was also based on the political centralisation, again, which defines socialism, and most importantly, it was based on communal ownership of property. That's kind of the whole reason why privatisation of farmland would come around, which was known as the enclosure movement, was the move away from all of that communal ownership. So, in other words, feudalism was actually more like communism, nothing at all like capitalism. You just took the gun and shot yourself in the foot.
For the most part, ANCAPs won't even refute these points. I've heard a lot of ANCAPs say it's not Anarcho Capitalism's job to be utilitarian, or provide the best standard of living for people, because it's all about having freedom.
Actually, it's really down to an individual to make something of themselves in a free market. But it's not as black and white as that. You do have strong charitable operations through voluntary actions. People do help one another.
Well, let me tell you, ANCAPs, it really is your job to provide a functioning society if you want to impose your twisted ideology on all of us.
Well, that's rather quite funny that you would say that. Why? Your socialism is faced with the knowledge problem. It's never been able to avoid it. Your socialism is faced with the economic calculation problem that absolutely obliterates it. Again, you can't avoid that problem. Then you've got the issue that money only comes from two places, the private sector or the printing press, which basically means if you want to get rid of private ownership and run the printing press, you're 100% going to drive the country into hyperinflation.
That's why I think anarcho-capitalism is just full of bullshit, and God help us if we ever have to live in it. I mean, even if you don't think communism would work at all, at least our actual goal is to create a society that's fair and livable.
That's the funniest thing that I've ever heard. You know, given the recorded history of what we've seen of communism in the real world, they are the most non-livable places. I mean, this is the thing, right? Let's just take West Germany and East Germany, for example. Did you see people trying to escape, West Germany over the wall for life in East Germany? You didn't see that, did you? So yeah, it's all a load of absolute silly nonsense. So let's have a look at some of the comments that I got in my previous video. As Entertainment Garrett goes on to mention, as an ANCAP, I would like to add that his point about property rights is ludicrous. There are examples of a stateless capitalist economy in which property rights were enforced by private courts and mutual contracts. An example would be in a society listed below, and of course he provides an argument. So that's quite an interesting comment. Of course there's a lot that I specifically don't really know on, anarcho capitalism, and I'm always welcome for these comments. Robert also goes on to mention, I love the appeal to Somalia. Brings a joyful tear to my eye every time. This other boy, a progressive voice, tries to talk about Somalia as if this is an example of anarchy. I mean, it's, as Philosoposum mentions, I'm also a minarchist, but I advocate for voluntary taxation. That is a system of taxation which the government collects funds on a voluntary basis. There are already some examples of this, such as toll roads, the post office, and the lottery. It must be said that I don't really particularly know if there was such a way to have such a voluntarist based tax system like that to have for government, then of course I would personally support that. As Pee-wee mentions, here's how human rights are a gift of nature. The average human has the natural ability to breathe and live, meaning that they have the right to not have the ability taken away from them. They have the right to life, to not get murdered. The average human has the natural ability to walk, meaning that they have the right to not have the ability taken away from them. They have the right to not get their kneecaps broken. Right, so it's quite a long comment. I completely agree with everything of what he's saying, and he's exactly right on the argument on the negative rights. These rights are somehow granted by the state, and it just isn't the case. Another comment by D-Man Cawmaster. He says, just remember, a slave consents to being a slave if he eats the bread his master brings to him and wears his clothes his master got him. The only thing is the very fact that at the end of the day, it's non-consensual. When you are a slave, you are a slave. You don't have a choice. It's not like you have a choice to leave, so it's a very different argument. Devin mentions, I've been thinking about that. I would love something like a ballot with some checkboxes on it saying which taxes you would like to pay, and which, depending on what taxes you are paying, you can make a certain choices to influence outcomes. I have not fully figured out yet. So let's say you pay taxes into military, you could vote on what war to go into, and that is the only example I have. It's quite an interesting argument. I just believe in the free and individual liberty, and it's important that you have, strong liberty to limit government as much as possible, because it will go on the path completely abuse you. I don't believe any system's perfect, believe me, it isn't. Peru mentions a robber is not any less a robber if he gives you a piece of candy after he robs your house. Completely agree. So anyway, folk, I think I've, gone through quite enough. If you've got anything you would like to add yourself, add in the comment section below, and I shall be sure to get back to you. Thank you for watching, and I shall talk to you later. Cheers.